This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for that introduction, making my attention deficit sound like a virtue. All right. And thank you all for having me today. And for letting me share my ideas that are near and dear to me, including the best brain games for brain protection and performance. And I will begin, per protocol, by disclosing any conflicts of interest. So, as mentioned, I founded a company called BrainJo that is a portmanteau of two of my favorite things in this world, brains and banjos. And the mission of BrainJo is to provide tools and resources for improving the health and function of people's brains, including some of the things that I'll be talking about today. And I started this company in an attempt to fulfill my mission as a neurologist to help people improve the health and function of their brains, which is an area that I've been researching and caring about for as long as I can remember, which is why I give talks like this one. But that said, in spite of my conflicts, my promise to you is that whenever truth comes into conflict with fame, glory, or my own personal interests, like any good scientist, I promise to always choose fame and glory. A brief word about my own background and how I've arrived where I am. So I've been interested in neuroscience and human cognition in particular for several decades. I received my undergraduate degree in cognitive neuroscience from Wesleyan University and decided to direct that interest into the field of neurology. So I became a neurologist and researcher involved in clinical trials, many of which were for Alzheimer's disease, none of which were successful. And for a number of reasons, over my first decade in clinical practice and research, I ultimately came to the conclusion that I and my colleagues were barking up the wrong tree, meaning that our failure to find meaningful treatments wasn't because we just hadn't found the right compound yet, but it's because we were looking in the wrong place. So if the reason that drug trials were failing over and over because they were just the wrong tool for this problem. And as you may have heard, I'm not the only one who has come to this conclusion, at least when it comes to Alzheimer's dementia. Notably, those who have the most financial stake in this, the drug companies, have been as well. These are just a few of the recent headlines along these lines. We can now add to this the story or the controversy surrounding the recent FDA approval of the drug aducanumab, where 10 out of 11 members of an FDA advisory committee of independent experts voted that there wasn't enough evidence to justify approval. And in fact, one of the FDA's primary justifications for granting approval, in spite of the objections, was not that the drug was clearly effective and worth the trade-offs and costs and side effects, but because they felt that not doing so would be too bad for morale, that it would be too demoralizing to acknowledge that after several decades of research in this area, with hundreds of billions spent, that we didn't have anything to show for it. So I realize all of that paints a pretty bleak picture, and if that was where this story ended, this would make for a terrible talk. But fortunately, that's not where the story ends, because years ago, I and a growing number of my colleagues also came to another conclusion, which is that we already have much of what we need to produce the outcomes that we've been wanting. And what is now clear to me is that most of the chronic conditions that doctors, including neurologists like myself, treat in this day and age are diseases of lifestyle, ones that are driven by mismatches between our present and ancestral habitat. And the best way to prevent and treat lifestyle disease is not with a drug, but with lifestyle. And none of these conditions that we see are the result of a single cause, but rather of a great many causes acting in combination, which means there won't be any silver bullets, and there won't be any smoking guns. So lifestyle can either be our biggest enemy or our biggest ally in human health. And the reason it is so powerful in either direction is because it influences us and our physiology at the level of evolutionary forces. So at the level of the forces and the inputs that we've been adapting to for millions of years. And this particular talk is about what is one of the biggest lifestyle factors of all for protecting the health and function of the brain over the course of our lives. One that's been recognized to some degree, but whose importance has been, in my view, somewhat misunderstood and underestimated. So this particular talk is in many ways a continuation of one that was given here by my good friend and collaborator, Dr. Tommy Wood. And there he reviewed what he and I refer to in an upcoming paper as the demand-driven decline theory of age-related cognitive decline and dementia, which would include most cases of Alzheimer's disease. So for those who weren't here, and to refresh the memories of those who were, I'll recap the salient points of that. So raise your hand if you'd like to keep your brain in the best possible condition for as long as you can. I think we're unanimous. I imagine everyone here values their brain and what it can do and considers keeping it in good condition an extremely high priority. So ultimately what we want is to not suffer the deterioration in brain structure and function and related cognitive and neurological decline that commonly occurs with advancing age. Another way to say this is that our ultimate goal would be to maintain our brain in the pristine condition of youth for as long as possible. So we want to maintain the robust and healthy brain on the left here and not end up with the atrophic and diseased one on the right. And it turns out that the typical person does maintain his or her brain in pristine condition for quite some time. So deterioration and loss of brain tissue, which is also known as brain atrophy, doesn't typically start until the third or fourth decade of life. And once it does, it tends to be slow at first and then starts to increase around the age of 60, at which time the rate of decline tends to accelerate. So here's that phenomenon represented graphically. Whether we're looking either at brain volume or cognitive function, we have this initial period of stability in the health of brain tissue and cognitive function in early life with our structural and functional decline, starting around the third and fourth decade, and then accelerating around the age of 60 and becoming nonlinear. Now this is the average, and there are exceptions. And here is that nonlinearity also reflected in the risk of Alzheimer's with age. So it is virtually negligible before the age of 65, and then the risk doubles every 5 years after the age of 65. And we also see that same nonlinear trajectory in the clinical course of Alzheimer's itself. So it's common to divide that course into early, mid, and late stages. And early stage lasts the longest, then middle, and then late stage is the shortest. So again, we see this nonlinear accelerating decline over time. And anyone who's witnessed someone in the later stages of Alzheimer's has probably seen this rapid decline firsthand. So these observations raise three really important questions. The answers, I think, are highly relevant for anyone who's looking to figure out how to arrest this process, and ones that we'll attempt to address today. So the first is, why is there this initial period of stability? What is keeping the brain stable and protected? What causes the deterioration to begin? And then why is that deterioration nonlinear once it starts? Why does it accelerate over time? So altogether, these observations suggest there are critical differences in the environment of early life and the environment of middle and late adulthood that are driving this decline. So what we'd like to know are, what are the environmental factors promoting stability of brain health and function in the first few decades of life, and deterioration in this nonlinear fashion thereafter. So we can represent this question as a Venn diagram. So if we're rounding up the suspects for the factors that lead to deterioration of the brain in adulthood and stability in youth, we're interested in areas of non-overlap between those environments of youth and adulthood. And then the question becomes, is it the presence of factors that arise during adulthood that leads to deterioration? Or is it the absence or loss of factors that were present in youth but missing in adulthood that does so? So is there something protective in the youth environment that's missing in the environment of adults who exhibit cognitive decline and age-related dementia? And I can tell you almost all of the research has been focused on this area of overlap and looking for presence of factors that are harmful in the adult environment rather than looking for an absence of something protective in the environment of youth, which I think is a natural inclination in all of us. Thus far, none of those suspects have panned out. The biggest target thus far has been amyloid protein, which is found in the plaques of Alzheimer's, but targeting with amyloid with a drug, which has been the big push over the past couple of decades, has not made a significant impact on the clinical course of Alzheimer's. So the common view that I think most of us had, that I had for a long time, is that this decline over time is due to age or the aging process, so some unstoppable force intrinsic to living things that leads to this inexorable deterioration with age. So this sort of inescapable decline that's a function of time spent alive. And this pie graph kind of represents the view of the causes of age-related deterioration that I think a lot of people have, that the bulk of it being due to that aforementioned process, also influenced by genetic, with a smaller proportion due to environmental factors, which includes lifestyle. So only a small amount being under our direct influence. But we keep learning over and over that so much of the decline with age and that we've long attributed to the aging process is, number one, heavily influenced by lifestyle and even reversible with lifestyle changes, which of course isn't compatible with the notion that these are caused by an unstoppable and irreversible process. So here's one of the latest headline-making research findings that you may have seen with the great headline, "New Poo, New You." So in a recent study, fecal transplants from young mice to old mice reversed the structural and functional signs of aging in the hippocampus. Again, this kind of result being incompatible with the idea that those deteriorations in older mice were due to a relentlessly progressive and irreversible process. And this is just one of a great many examples of this sort of thing that we have now, of these age-associated changes in tissue structure and function that we once thought inevitable and irreversible, shown to be neither. So again, the point here being that the evidence indicates that cognitive decline and age-related dementia, that much of it is preventable and even reversible, and that interventions that act at the level of evolutionary forces, like the gut microbiome in that last paper, are our biggest levers for prevention and treatment. So this pie chart is what I think of as a more accurate representation of the relative contributions of the factors causing age-related declines in cognition, with environment, including lifestyle, being the biggest driver. So if our lifestyle and environment are driving this process, then what are the key lifestyle factors, and how do we utilize them to our advantage? Along those lines, I imagine many of you are well aware that there is now a substantial body of research demonstrating that the health and function of the brain over time is strongly correlated with cognitive activity. And the study that kind of kicked off this entire area of research is the Nun study. So in it, a group of 678 Catholic sisters who were members of the School Sisters of Notre Dame were tracked over many years. And the purpose was to examine the relationship between various factors and their long-term cognitive and neurological health. And the first headline-making finding published from this study was that features of their writing in early life, in early adulthood, were significantly correlated with their Alzheimer's risk in late life. So in this study, the first one from this, they examined the journals of the women in it from the ages of 18 to 32, and then performed cognitive exams on those same women between the ages of 75 and 95. And they looked specifically at whether idea density in their writing in early adulthood was associated with the likelihood of Alzheimer's in late life. And idea density is intended as a measure of how efficiently you convey a given idea in your writing, or how much information is packed into someone's writing relative to the number of words that are used. And in the first set of subjects that were studied, low idea density in early life was present in all of those with Alzheimer's versus none of those who died without it. Since then, many more studies have been published showing this association between a cognitively active life and a lower likelihood of cognitive decline and dementia. And of course, this research has spawned an entire industry of digital brain games that are intended to challenge and improve the health and function of the brain. And of course, figuring out the best brain games is the purpose of this talk. So, question now is, how does cognitive activity protect against cognitive decline and age-related dementia? The prevailing explanation for how this works has been a concept known as cognitive reserve. So the idea here is that cognitive activity helps to create redundancy for different kinds of knowledge by creating more representations of that knowledge throughout the brain, so that even if there is brain deterioration occurring from a disease, its functional impact is less in someone who has more redundancy or more reserve. So if your memory of your 21st birthday or how to play chess is distributed across more locations, then it takes more tissue deterioration to degrade that memory. So for example, we'll say the person on the left has played a lot of chess, and because of that, his or her knowledge about chess is distributed across multiple networks. On the other hand, the person with the right has not, so it doesn't have distributed representations. And so if a particular area of the brain deteriorates as a result of something like disease or trauma, then it will obliterate the memory of chess in someone without reserve, but not in the person with it. So you can think of the cognitive reserve concept kind of like backup engines on a plane. The idea is that cognitive activity creates backup systems for knowledge. So in the case of a plane, if one engine goes out, the plane still flies because the other engines can keep it in the air. So again, this backup metaphor represents the cognitive reserve explanation for why consistently challenging our minds would protect against dementia and cognitive decline. But we now have research indicating that there's more going on than that. We've long known that physical activity strongly influences the condition of the body in both directions. So we all know that we can significantly improve the health and function of our cardiovascular and musculoskeletal systems through various forms of exercise. And how does challenging our muscles and our heart and lungs benefit us? Does lifting weights help us by creating backup muscles in case our regular muscles fail? And we might call that the muscular reserve theory of how lifting weights helps us. But of course, we know that's not how it works. It benefits us by restoring and strengthening our existing muscles and connective tissue and improving the efficiency of gas exchange in the lungs and the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. But importantly, we also know that this phenomenon works both ways, in that a lack of aerobic and muscular activity causes our cardiovascular and musculoskeletal systems to deteriorate. And clinically, the place where we see this the most is with hospitalization, especially as people get older, and with a condition called hospital-associated deconditioning. So on average, older adults spend 83% of their time in bed and 12% in a chair when they're in the hospital. And the impact of that inactivity is significant and it's widespread, so including negative effects on muscle mass, strength, muscle protein synthesis, heart and lung function, metabolism, digestion, cognitive function. And what's also notable here, there's a striking overlap between the deteriorations that are observed with hospital-associated deconditioning and those that are seen with aging. And here's a quote from a review paper on the topic of hospital-acquired deconditioning, which is that the functional deficits present in older adults with frailty closely mirror the deficits seen in older adults with hospital-associated deconditioning. And here is a graph of this idea showing that hospital-associated deconditioning appears to be the development of frailty just on a compressed timescale. And frailty is, of course, often thought of as a consequence of the aging process. Yet here's something that would suggest otherwise, because we have the same physiological deteriorations occurring from a major reduction in physical activity or a major reduction in the demands placed on the musculoskeletal and cardiovascular systems. And importantly, we also know that these things can be reversed by increasing physical demands, which is why these folks all go to rehab. So once again, we see something long attributed to this inevitable aging process that's instead being driven by lifestyle and environment. And what's important for our purposes today is that this phenomenon also occurs in the brain and nervous system, not just our musculoskeletal system and heart and lungs. Here's one of my favorite studies on this topic, partly because it was published by one of my heroes, Dr. Michael Merzenich and his colleagues, using rats as subjects. So rats also exhibit declines in neurological function with age, including in the auditory system. And so in this study, they wanted to see if cognitive activity in the form of auditory training could impact those changes. So they took 20 different functional characteristics of hearing that adult rats perform worse on than young rats. And with 1 month of training, were able to restore all 20 of those characteristics back to a youthful state. And it furthermore demonstrated restoration of brain tissue involved in hearing. So, in other words, consistently placing demands on the adult brain that were outside the bounds of its typical daily experience led to reversal of age-related deterioration in the brain, both functionally and structurally. So, consistently challenging auditory tasks restored the relevant brain tissue to a more youthful condition. So if you recall a moment ago, I said that the initial theory about how a cognitively active lifestyle protected against cognitive decline and dementia was that it created these backup systems. Again, that's not how it works in our heart, lungs, muscles, and connective tissue, and that's not what's happening in this last case either. We have sustained increase in cognitive demands, restoring the hardware itself, so restoring tissue back to a healthier state. So we're not, in this case, creating a backup engine through cognitive activity. We're restoring the broken one. And this phenomenon where the health and function of our tissue is directly linked to the demands we placed on it, something I'll now refer to as demand coupling. So again, we've long known that demand coupling is something that exists in the cardiovascular and musculoskeletal systems. It also clearly exists in the nervous system as well. It has profound influence over the cardiovascular and musculoskeletal systems, and I think it also has profound influence on the health and function of the brain and nervous system. So I like to think of this as the demands we place on tissues driving the position of a growth and repair slider that we can move from low to high. So when it's all the way to the right, our growth and repair mechanisms in a particular tissue are set to maximum. When it's all the way to the left, they're at a minimum. And because of this, because of demand coupling, the position of this slider is directly linked to the demands placed on that tissue. So on the one hand, you have someone who is immobilized and bedbound, so demands are extremely low, and in that case, the repair slider is near zero, which results in the rapid and multi-systemic deteriorations that I just talked about with hospitalization. And then on the other hand, you have someone like an Olympic athlete, represented here by the most decorated Olympian of all time, Michael Phelps. And I chose him because I remember during the Olympic coverage, the announcers all marveling about his diet both about how much he ate and what he ate. So at the height of his training, he was eating around 10,000 calories a day and eating anything he could get his hands on. Lots of good quality protein, but also pizza and pancakes and French toast with syrup and powdered sugar and ice cream. So here's someone who's putting his body under significant physical stress and eating a diet that would make any of us here extremely ill, and yet he's in demonstrably better physical condition than virtually every human on the planet. And why might that be? Is because his growth and repair signal is turned up max. Now, we're so used to the idea that physical inactivity is bad for us that I think it's easy to overlook that it's somewhat counterintuitive and peculiar. So if you have a prized possession like a painting and you want to protect it from deteriorating, what do you do with it? You keep it walled off and protected, and you try to shield it from everything. So it'd be very, very reasonable to think that that's the best way to protect our body and our health, right? That living in a bubble and doing nothing and leading the least stressful existence we can would be the best way to lead a long and healthy life. And yet, we know it's just the opposite, that doing that is catastrophic for our health. But why? Why, in other words, why is doing nothing so bad for us? And to understand this phenomena, I think it's helpful to imagine an equilibrium that's determining the integrity of biological tissues and systems over time. So on one side we have damage, and the other side is repair. And there are two key differences with living things compared to non-living things. One is that sustaining life and generating energy through metabolism generates waste and damage that must be dealt with in order to maintain tissue structure and function. And the other is that, as discussed, growth and repair mechanisms are coupled to demands, a mechanism that likely exists to ensure the efficient distribution of energy. And lifestyle actually modulates both sides. Lifestyle can increase or reduce damage, and lifestyle can stimulate and support or suppress repair. But regardless, when damage exceeds repair, no matter how that happens, tissues will deteriorate. And that disruption can either be from excessive damage or insufficient repair. So here's an animation just demonstrating why doing nothing can reduce our repair and recovery signal, disrupting this equilibrium, and then leading to a decline in tissue structure and function. So even if nothing is changing on the demand side, tissues will deteriorate simply because we've reduced the amount of repair. So this is similar to what happens in our muscles. We know that protein is essential for building muscles, and yet just eating more protein by itself without challenging our muscles won't help them at all. And that's because they will only grow if you've created a need to do so by increasing the demands placed upon them. So it's only protein plus demands that leads to muscle growth. And furthermore, the greater the demands we place on them, the more protein we consume, and the bigger they grow. And just as it is with muscles, even if we were to take all the best vitamins and eat all the right foods to support growth and repair in our brain and get all the best medical care, if we don't send a strong repair signal, the brain will still deteriorate. So it's entirely possible that there are compounds out there that have failed clinical trials for dementia that would be effective if they were given in the context of a strong growth and repair signal while they're being taken. Just like you would conclude that increasing protein intake doesn't lead to muscle growth if your subjects aren't simultaneously doing some sort of resistance training. So in muscles, we increase the growth and repair signal by lifting heavier things, and in the brain, we do so through cognitively challenging activities. So remember earlier, when looking for the environmental factors that were driving cognitive decline and age-related dementia, we said it could be from the presence of something harmful in the adult environment, not present in the environment of youth, or the absence of something protective in the environment of youth. Here's a graphical representation of the cognitive demands over a typical human lifespan. They're extraordinarily high in childhood. We have multiple developmental programs that are running to create the neural machinery needed to control the three most sophisticated cognitive capabilities most of us will ever develop, which are talking, walking, and socializing. And then on top of the fact that culturally, we've decided that early life is the primary time for learning new complex things. So that's when you acquire the knowledge and skills that you'll then deploy as an adult. And on average, that drops off markedly by middle age, and typically even more so as we hit retirement. And this dashed line is representing the fact that this isn't to scale. I think scale would be off the screen. But here we found something that's present in the environment of youth, but not present in that of adults. And so thanks to demand coupling, how would we expect that to impact our growth and repair slider? Something like this, turned up max in early life, and then dropping off significantly by middle age, and then continuing to decline. And how would we predict that to impact the health and function of the brain? Something like this, which of course is the typical trajectory that I showed you earlier. And if you recall, I mentioned that earlier that both cognitive decline and age-related dementia exhibit this nonlinearity where the rate of progression accelerates over time, or increases over time, which is something we would predict if demand coupling is driving this deterioration, because ultimately we reach a point where loss of function constrains the scope of activities that we can engage in and the demands that we can place on the brain. So reduced demands leads to reduced repair and recovery, which leads to tissue deterioration, which then leads to reduced capacity of what we're capable of doing, which then further constrains the scope of demands. So once our capabilities significantly constrain the scope of what we're able to do, then we'd expect our decline to accelerate because of this feed-forward autocatalytic process. So this is why hospital-associated deconditioning happens so quickly. This is why mid to late-stage dementia is so much shorter. This is why breaking a hip is so catastrophic as people get older. So here are the three key ideas of demand-driven decline. Number one is that cognitive activity leads to hardware restoration, not just backup representations of knowledge. Number two, that cognitive inactivity is a driving factor in age-related cognitive decline in dementia. And three, that we've underestimated the degree to which cognitive demands and challenges decline over time, over the typical lifespan. And I would hypothesize that maintaining a truly cognitively demanding lifestyle throughout our lives, along with minimizing environmental mismatch, would prevent and even reverse age-related cognitive decline in dementia. All right, now the million-dollar question is what sorts of activities, right? So we know our goal here is to send the strongest repair signal possible, which means we want to find activities that engage as much of the brain tissue as possible. So we want activities that provide a whole brain workout, in particular, a workout for our cerebral cortex, the area that houses the cognitive capabilities that deteriorate with age. And we know that compound movements that challenge the whole body, rather than isolation exercises, are best for our physical health, and we want the same for our brain. So we want whole brain workouts. We want to continue to engage in activities throughout our lives that provide a challenge similar to those that were a natural part of early life, so that we keep that repair slider fully turned on. And there are a few ways we might go about figuring out what our best candidates here would be. One would be to use our understanding of cognitive neuroscience to identify activities that produce widespread brain activation. So as you probably know, the brain is partly modular in how it's designed. So as a very cursory overview, we have your occipital lobes with circuits that are involved in processing and analyzing visual information. In the temporal lobes, circuits involved with processing and analyzing auditory information, including decoding the meaning of words and recognizing familiar faces. In the parietal lobes, we have circuits involved in processing and analyzing tactile information, as well as ones that integrate information from all of our senses so that we can extract more meaning from it. And in the frontal lobes, we have multiple areas involved with coordinating our movements, including the motor plans required for moving the vocal apparatus to produce words. The frontal lobes are also heavily involved in planning and attention, concentration, reasoning, and problem solving. So a whole brain workout would challenge all of these major areas on both sides of the brain, not just isolated systems. Another way we can approach this question is to ask, what are the kinds of activities the brain is engaged with at its time of peak health and function, which, as we've seen, is the first couple of decades of life. And remember, it's the absence of these factors that we've identified as a suspect in cognitive decline and dementia. And it's during childhood development that we're constructing the machinery to support the big three cognitive capabilities, walking, talking, and socializing. As adults, we tend to underappreciate their complexity because they come so easily. So, surely writing a symphony is harder than talking, or riding a skateboard is harder than learning how to walk. But ease comes from how effectively something has been learned and isn't an accurate reflection of its inherent difficulty or complexity. And during childhood, we also have to develop this incredibly sophisticated perceptual system for understanding the data that's coming in from our senses. So initially, that sensory data our brain gets is just an undifferentiated mass of neural signals that enter by way of a sensory organ. And we take the example of hearing. Everything that we hear comes from air hitting up against a tiny little membrane in our ear, known as the eardrum. Those vibrations are transduced in the inner ear to nerve impulses. And from those impulses, your brain has to build networks that can analyze them and create this rich, detailed, and meaningful auditory experience. So just think of all the sounds you hear even right now and how effortlessly you categorize and understand them. And all of that is simply extracted from vibrations of air against a drum. So you can appreciate what a monumental task doing that is. And during development, the brain is constructing the perceptual machinery necessary to analyze, categorize, and extract meaning from the world outside and inside us through all of our senses. Machinery that as adults is fully developed and allows you and I to effortlessly make sense of what's happening around us. So again, just to reiterate, when we look at childhood development from the brain's point of view like this, it's easy to appreciate just how incredibly demanding a time it is for the brain. So every child is getting a whole brain workout every day simply because he or she is working on constructing the networks that are needed to be a functioning and independent adult. And the main reason why demands drop off so significantly in adulthood is that most of those networks are done developing by late childhood. We can zoom out even further, trying to answer this question, and look at the human brain through the lens of evolution. So the brain is ultimately an organ for maintaining homeostasis and really anticipating future homeostatic needs. But the distinguishing feature of humans and the human brain is our ability to do this in a wide range of habitats. And our brain has achieved this through three uniquely human cognitive capabilities. The first being the ability to recognize patterns in perceptual data, so to identify recurrent patterns in the environment that allow us to make predictions about the future. The ability to acquire new complex motor skills and complex movement patterns that are specific to an environment and culture. So you probably can't climb a coconut tree like a Katavan, and they probably can't type 60 words per minute on a keyboard, but both are learned motor skills that allow us to succeed in the environment we find ourselves in. And then communication and cooperation to recruit other humans towards a shared goal. So these are the capabilities that have allowed us to flourish as a species, and natural selection has been continuing to shape the neural networks supporting those capabilities for a few million years. So naturally, the activities that draw upon these sorts of capabilities, pattern recognition, acquisition of complex motor skills, communication and cooperation, should activate the largest areas of cortex, and so would also be ideal candidates for a whole brain workout. So to summarize, the best brain games would provide a whole brain workout, reproducing the cognitive demands of childhood. Such as? Well, it so happens that likely, not by coincidence, everybody likes Eddie Van Halen, humans all around the world have been performing activities that fit those specifications for a very long time in the form of music and dance. So music and dance have been found in every human society ever encountered, and something we've likely been doing for quite a while. The earliest preserved musical instruments are bone flutes, like this one, and the oldest one date as far back as 60,000 years. So I think that's a really important bit of information because it means that human brains find these activities really, really rewarding, even though they don't meet any obvious survival need. And yet, our brain's reward systems exist to encourage us to do things that are good for us or to discourage us from doing things that are bad for us. So why do human brains think music and dance is really good for us? Could it be that our brains love these things because they give us a whole brain workout? Well, let's look at the cognitive machinery involved. And we can do this both theoretically based on our knowledge of cognitive neuroscience and empirically based on the many studies that have been done in this area, especially in the realm of music. So let's start by what happens in the brain when we listen to music. So the first area activated is the primary auditory cortex, which is in the superior temporal gyrus. So something that we'd expect of auditory input of any kind. But if it stopped there, it wouldn't have too much of an impact on us because the feelings that we get from music come from extracting higher level patterns in that auditory data. So after the information enters primary auditory cortex, it's then widely distributed to multiple higher order auditory networks to perform different sorts of analyses on them. So that encompasses adjacent areas of cortex in the temporal lobes, but we know from functional imaging studies that it involves even more than that, activating multiple areas of cerebral cortex in both hemispheres, including significant activation of motor cortex, likely because of the tight linkage between music and movement. And you also see activation of sensory cortex, which is especially pronounced in musicians. Not surprisingly, the area differs depending on the instrument that they play. And you see activation of visual association cortex, as well as the basal ganglia, which is involved in movement, and the limbic system, which is where our emotional experience of music likely comes from. So in the realm of sound input, this pattern of widespread activation is unique to music. One definition of music is sounds with patterns, and it's the existence of those patterns that really sets our brain on fire and why it has such a profound influence over us. So here was the Science News headline reporting on this phenomenon that listening to music, quote, lights up the whole brain. And again, that's just listening. When we add performing music, things are taken to another level, and we find an ideal candidate for a whole brain workout. And again, if we look at the major evolutionary design specifications for human brains, we see that musical performance satisfies all three. So we find music pleasurable when we recognize patterns, especially when we make predictions that are fulfilled. And then, of course, performing music requires the acquisition of complex bimanual motor skills, which involves large areas of brain. And lastly, performing music almost always involves other people. So music itself is a form of communication, something that we do for and with each other, especially playing music with other musicians. And then if you throw in playing in the context of a band, you're pretty much recruiting every major cognitive network the brain has. So based on our understanding of the design specs of human brains or what it evolved to do, we expect music performance to be as cognitively demanding as any human endeavor, which is exactly what's been found in functional imaging. And you could make essentially the same claims for dance. With dance, we must learn complex motor patterns and then synchronize them with the patterns we recognize in music. Through dance, we can acquire an expanding repertoire of complex motor skills. And of course, it often requires coordination and synchronization with other dance partners, other dancers. So there's a strong element of communication and cooperation. Now, music has received more of the research here simply because it's harder to do an fMRI on someone who's dancing. But I think it's safe to say that it would give musical performance a run for its money. And then plus, with dance, you get added physical benefits that don't typically come with musical performance. So what does the existing research say about the link between playing music and cognitive decline and dementia? So here's data from a meta-analysis of 13 studies on this subject, concluding that there were cognitive benefits, but the benefits were also generalized functions not so closely related to the specific skills trained by musical practice. So this has been one of the drawbacks with the brain games industry is that its generalizability has not been shown. So again, here we have evidence that's indicative of widespread benefits to the brain tissue. And most of the improvements observed occurred in age-sensitive cognitive functions, which of course is exactly our objective here. Now, given the natural limitations of this kind of research, it can be hard to pin down direct cause and effect relationships. At best, our empirical data will be a convincing body of correlations, but this is one of the more compelling studies, this one being a twin study looking at the link between playing a musical instrument and the risk of both dementia and age-related cognitive decline. So here you have identical twins where one plays an instrument and one doesn't. And then what they found was that the twin who didn't play an instrument was about 3 times more likely to develop cognitive decline or dementia than the twin who did. And you can't get any more direct than this. Here's a study looking at MRI scans of professional, amateur, and non-musicians and compared their predicted brain age to their actual brain age. So this is utilizing a machine learning tool that's been trained to predict someone's age based on an MRI scan. And what they found was that the predicted brain age for musicians was on average about 5 years younger than that of non-musicians. And interestingly, the effect was most pronounced for amateur musicians. And I'll give you a few thoughts on why that may be in a few minutes. And these were on relatively young subjects as well. Here's a study that addresses the impact of dance on brain health. So this is from a New England Journal study on the risks of dementia associated with different leisure activities. And so here we find that of the leisure physical activities studied, only dance was associated with a lower risk of dementia, with frequent dancers' risk being 0.24 times the norm. Now, overall, the research on the connection between physical activity and the risk of cognitive decline and dementia has been inconsistent, with the overall consensus being that it likely improves cognitive function, that it might reduce dementia risk. But of course, not all physical activity is created equal, and it's a broad category. So the authors of this New England Journal study speculated here that perhaps the missing factor is the nature of the physical activity and its cognitive demands. So the common feature amongst the leisure activities that weren't associated with a reduced risk of dementia, things like swimming, walking, climbing stairs, is that they aren't cognitively challenging. They can all be performed on autopilot and just rely on automated motor programs, which is much less likely with dance, especially if it's new to you or you're working on new styles or routines or dancing with other people. And I should add that one of the great things about music and dance from the standpoint of cognitive challenge is that new learning is baked into the design. So every new musical piece, every new dance routine requires this construction of novel neural networks, which is not the same with things like running or walking or swimming. Sports are another kind of physical activity that humans find extremely rewarding, some of which likely provide a whole brain cognitive challenge similar to music and dance. So a while back, ESPN put together an expert panel to rank various sports in terms of their level of difficulty. And this was their final ranking, which they arrived at by rating sports on a number of different dimensions. But a few of those dimensions reflected the amount of cognitive challenge, including things like the requirement of complex motor skills and coordination, as well as strategic thinking. And if we look at their rankings just along those dimensions, these were their top 10. Again, this wasn't a highly rigorous process, but I think it kind of helps in thinking about the kinds of activities that are likely to provide the most brain benefits from a physical standpoint. So the complexity of the motor programs, the perceptual systems that must be developed to play the sport, the relative importance of strategy. We can all appreciate that learning to play ice hockey or tennis would place much greater demands on the brain and nervous system than something like distance running. And that being said, I think virtually any skill sport will provide cognitive and health benefits well in excess of any digital brain game, especially if that sport is still relatively new to you. Beyond the world of sports, there are still other activities that activate large swaths of brain and help us in reproducing the childhood learning environment, including learning a new language, other performing arts, like things like acting and magic and puppeteering, teaching, as well as social games like cards and board games. One important thing to note here is that the greatest benefits are going to be in the initial learning phase. So the double-edged sword of learning is that as our expertise grows in a domain, it becomes less challenging and less demanding on the brain. This is why we must look to new activities in the first place as adults in order to maintain the cognitive demands of childhood, because we've largely mastered the big three capabilities that we learn then. And most endeavors follow the 80-20 rule, with our initial efforts providing the greatest return. So the difference between the not playing and being an intermediate is huge, whereas the difference between being an expert and a master is small, but takes many more years to get to. So that means the greatest brain benefits are likely when you're a total beginner, and that once you've reached a certain level of expertise, it's better from a brain health perspective to add something new to learn. And if you recall, in the brain age study, it was the amateur musicians who had the youngest looking brains, more so than the professional ones. And one reason for that is what I just talked about, where the benefits to the brain are going to be greater when you're less experienced at something. Another might be that amateur musicians are typically doing music on the side, in addition to whatever they do for a living, which could mean they're more likely to be leading a cognitively challenging life. So there's the 80-20 rule graphically represented. Another reason why our lives become so much less cognitively challenging with age is because we adults don't like to feel incompetent or inept at things. So for children, this is the norm, so they expect it. But adults have gotten used to the feeling of mastery in almost all areas of their lives. And I know from working with tens of thousands of people that the older people get, the more they resist the struggle that comes with new learning and real challenges. But as the last graphic showed, it's in the struggle where we get the greatest benefits, both when it comes to learning and when it comes to improvements in brain health. So it's the time in our lives when having that struggle is most important. So embrace the struggle that comes with learning new complex things. And we already have this mentality around exercise. So when we work our muscles to exhaustion, we feel exhilarated because we know we've put forth our best effort and we'll see the greatest benefits. Yet when we work our brain to failure, we typically feel frustrated and disappointed in ourselves for not doing better. when the reality is, in both cases, we're providing the strongest growth and repair signal possible. And the great thing is there are so many options here. So even just sticking with one musical instrument, there are new styles to learn, new genres of music, and of course, an endless supply of new songs and material. Same is true of dance. And then, of course, there's a huge array of skill sports we can choose from. So the key is just finding something that you enjoy and always be learning something new. And here's a remarkable statistic that's cited in the book Range by David Epstein, which is that Nobel Prize winners are 22 times more likely than their peers to be a performing artist of some kind. And note that it's not reading more books in their field or more degrees that's giving them the advantage here, but rather consistently engaging in whole brain workouts. So before this talk, you might have been surprised by a statistic like that, but now you understand why being a performing artist would be so good for brain health and cognitive function. All right, to summarize the key ideas here, first is that cognitive demands regulate repair and recovery, that the drop in demands after early life may be a key driver of age-related cognitive decline and dementia, including the major forms of Alzheimer's, that whole brain workouts are best for maintaining a youthful brain, and music and dance are the poster children, and that the return on our efforts diminishes after the initial 80-20. So important to be always learning something new. And remember, from the perspective of brain health, the more terrible you are, the greater the benefits. So I submit to you that music and the performing arts are the ultimate brain food, and that's why we love them so much. Lastly, after spending several decades in the neurosciences, I think that there is extraordinary potential in every human brain, far beyond what we presently see. I think every brain is capable of what we currently view as genius-level insights and creativity, and is capable of achieving high levels of expertise in any domain. But in order to realize that potential, we mustn't prematurely adopt narratives about ourselves and our limitations, which includes the conventional narratives about cognitive decline and dementia that I've challenged here, because those narratives can all too easily become self-fulfilling. So if we all keep our minds fully open to the possibilities, and I fully believe we can usher in a revolution in human intelligence and well-being. And of course, I'm here at the IHMC, a place that's at the leading edge of bringing that to fruition. So with that, I say thank you for listening, and thank you for having me here.
So remember, we have time for questions. When Josh calls on you, please wait for the microphone to come before asking the question. We've got Matt over here.
That's fine, I can do that.
I'll give you an assist here.
Oh, I can do it.
So maybe while we're waiting for Matt, and then we'll pass it right to your, right after that, Matt.
So with all this background, what do you think that says about our current educational system? Right? Because we focus on calculus, which no one ever uses after they graduate, except for one, maybe 2% or less. And then we don't do any arts, and that's the stuff you would take with you your entire life and apparently help your brain live longer.
Yeah, I think the way we do it right now is inverted. I think that those should be the if we think, it depends on what we think of as the goals of our childhood education, right? Is it to equip them with a set of facts that they need to know, or is it to support cognitive development and brain development? And if it's to support brain development, we've got a lot of work to do. And so not just, supporting the health of the brain also involves the environment that those brains are in. But also, what activities they're engaged in, what's going to activate the widest amounts of cortex, what's going to support the networks that they're working on presently, the right things at the right time, all that. So, yeah, I 100% agree. I think, on both ends of the spectrum, we should be looking far more at the arts in terms of what they do for brain development.
Thanks, Josh. Great talk.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it. Fully agree with the concepts of plasticity and adaptability in human functioning, and the importance of overload in stressing the system that leads to those changes in human functioning. I'd like to pick up on the concept of specificity a little bit, though. My background is in cognitive science and in expert performance. And what the research in that domain tells us is that expertise is very specific to the performance environment. So practice leads to specific adaptations that are unique to the constraints of the performance environment. So I can tell you with certainty that if you engage in deliberate practice, that your musical performance will improve. But before anybody runs out and starts practicing music for the cause of trying to improve cognitive function, I'm less convinced on that issue. And all the data that exists is generally correlational in nature. And when you look at the research that's been done on expert performance across different domains, sport for instance, and scientists have measured what you might call hardware components of cognitive function, like vision, working memory, and software components of cognitive function, which are very task-specific. So the ability of basketball players to anticipate in basketball, for instance. And the evidence suggests that the hardware components do not differentiate. In fact, they account for less than 5% of the variance in performance, and 95% is accounted for by these software factors. So I guess, and I haven't got an answer to this, I just know what the state of the literature is from a sport expertise perspective, but if we bring it back into the cognitive decline issue, it's a very practical question, for instance. You know, if I have the choice between doing 2 hours of brain training each week to try and slow down the rate of cognitive decline, or spending 2 hours practicing a crossword, I know that 2 hours of practicing the crossword will make me improve my ability to perform on the crossword task, but I'm not sure that the generic training is going to improve general or specific cognitive function. So again, it comes back to that issue, you know, the specificity of practice, the specificity of training, as opposed to the generality of it.
Right.
Don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
My thought there, I mean, I agree that that has been the limitation of particularly brain games. It's, you know, getting back to the idea of an isolation workout versus a whole brain workout. And the issue with, you know, like I've talked about with the, you know, the 80-20 rule, if you're, you know, if you're just optimizing for brain health, you wouldn't want to over-index on one domain and develop a high-level expertise. You know, assuming if that was all your, you know, energy is devoted towards that, you would want to, because the more you do, the more you're just focusing on one specific area, and probably, you know, less brain is required. You know, the early, you know, first picking up your musical instrument is going to be the most challenging time, at the time when you're going to be recruiting networks that, if you image the same brain, you know, 2 years later, if it's still learning, they're no longer going to be involved. So I agree that as expertise develops, the returns from a brain health standpoint, right, are diminished, just in terms of because there's less tissue being activated.
Throughout the talk, you equated the brain demand to like normal muscle strength working out and exercise. So much like with strength exercise, there's the possibility of straining your muscles or even tearing them beyond a certain point. Is there an equivalent of that with the brain exercising, or is it essentially limitless in what you can do?
So that's a good question. As far as I know, there's no research that could provide an intelligent answer to that, or a definite answer to from the standpoint of, is there any sort of health tissue consequence to that? I think there's definitely evidence for in learning. You know, there's points which you can go too far, and you know where more is less, right? Where you training for too long, and just like in sport, you can overtrain. The same thing can happen when you're, you know, with overlearning or whatever. You know, partly because your attention rate is limited. And so if the ideal scenario is focused attention, deliberate practice, a nice session, give your brain really good inputs. If those inputs are less quality as your attention fades, then the results you get will be less as well. So from the learning standpoint, yes, but I don't know of anything analogous to, like straining a muscle where.
Josh, great talk. I really appreciate this. And it's actually a question to Mark's point. This question came up when you were talking. Obviously, the world rewards domain-specific expertise. Is there a thought on how one challenges their brain in domain-specific manners? And in order to, like, say, what you're talking about is taking yourself out of your domain and going into another arena that's totally, largely not tangential, just out of your wheelhouse, where you learn a lot and there's this general health effect. But can that not be applied into a domain-specific effect or a manner, and something that can drive, let's say, expertise or something like that? Challenge it to a greater degree that one has. So if one shoots basketballs every single day and gets really good at that, examples of Jordan and Kobe Bryant, et cetera, is there a way to actually change that training to make it more effective, maybe using some of the thoughts behind this general brain health? Or do you have a thought on that?
My inclination is yes, there would be. I haven't thought too much about what specifically that would be. I mean, there are instances like with music where if you're stuck somewhere, that you do things to change the challenge, and you get sort of by doing so you break through something that was previously limiting. But I don't know outside of that. So I think the phenomenon, there's a precedent for that sort of phenomenon, at least in musical learning, but I don't know, other domains.
Yeah. One more.
You mentioned when we're young, we are learning so much because we have to. Is it possible to overwhelm children with learning too much? Like, I'm thinking you mentioned arts and music should be in school, or should that be left for later? So we're beginners when we're older at these activities.
Right. That's a great question. I mean, I don't have a definitive answer for that, but I would say what I wish there was more of is an understanding what specific broad cognitive networks are being worked on at a particular point in time, and focusing our energies on supporting those. And then, that's where, the arts and music could come in and be sort of developmentally appropriate. I think that that's another place where we may be causing harm but not realizing it, is on developing certain cognitive skills that are mistimed, and not appreciating the opportunity costs there. So, for example, just we are all heavily left, language focused, right? We are that part of our brain is extremely dominant in most people, and that's reinforced heavily by how we educate. So we homogenize brains in that regard. So if you're optimizing for sort of diversity of cognition, you wouldn't want to do that. You'd sort of want to develop brains, but sort of then allow them to develop on their own path. And I think that I worry that with how we do reading and so forth, that we're reinforcing certain networks far too early.
Well, Josh, thanks for giving us hope and insight that we can cognitively age better. Let's thank our speaker one more time.
Thank you.